Hey everybody. So this week we're going to be looking at chapter 4 for world history here, early world history, China's classical age up to 221 BCE. So up to 221 BCE, civilization in early China. So the emergence of civilization in China. China, as we know it today, is quite a bit different than in ancient times. But it encompasses 6 different major regions or countries almost. It's almost like 6 different countries put together in one country, one region. Um, and today's China is much larger than what we're going to be talking about here. Much larger area than what we're going to be discussing during this chapter. Impact of geography. So China is a very diverse area: mountains, prairies, deserts. Uh, Also very isolated from any other early civilization. They developed almost in a bubble, as opposed to the other ones we've discussed, all the interconnectivities. We see very little connection with China, almost no evidence of connection with the earliest civilizations in China, which seems to give rise to the idea that they developed entirely independently, which further sort of gives rise to the, the theory that once a population learns agriculture, learns how to domesticate crops and animals, civilization is inevitable. It seems to happen no matter where it is in the world. And a big part of this chapter will also be, well, almost the whole chapter, will also be differentiating between northern and southern China. They developed in very differently, often independently of each other, and they are 2 very different civilizations, and yet similar. A lot of similarities as well. So northern China, it's flatter, it's colder, drier than the south. The dominant soil type is loess. I don't know if I even have it on my slide. Loess, loess. Very fine, very fertile soil. The rainfall up there, and again, as all early civilizations, developed along rivers. This one developed along the Yellow River, which is, reason it's called yellow is that loess, that fine sand, or it's not sand again, it's soil, but it's almost powdery, and when it goes into the river, it turns yellow, hence Yellow River. It easily floods, the same as other civilizations, which means early Chinese had to learn how to control the water. They had to build dikes, canals, waterways, and similar thing. It would flood, it would overflow its banks, it would bring down fertile soil, which made all of the land near the rivers very fertile. The river gets its color from the soil erosion. Sparse rainfall, though. Little rainfall, which meant civilization was much more closely tied to the river. Southern China gets a lot more rain. It's a lot wetter. Crops are typically wheat and millet. Wheat and millet both require little water. Therefore, it made a lot of sense, or can survive with a lot less water. Southern China is warmer, wetter, increased moisture, creates a very lush, watery environment, which is very well suited to rice production. These pictures here, you have a water buffalo right there on the right, and on the left you have, that is millet. That is millet growing on the left, another grain. Rice production is good, and that river is based on the Yangtze. That civilization is based around the Yangtze River. Now, had these been in 2 different places in the world, these would have probably developed independently as totally different civilizations. But because there were so many similarities in the region, and because the Yangtze and Yellow are relatively close, we know there would have been a lot of cross-communication, cross-trade between different groups. over time periods moving between these two rivers. And don't get me wrong, there's lots of little tributaries that run off of these two rivers as well. So there was a lot of interconnectivity. But it also should be clear that had even just one of these rivers existed, a Chinese civilization would have certainly developed along that one river. But because there were two dominant rivers separated by, separated by something like 2,000 miles, but yet it was close enough that they had connections. The preferred mode of transportation was boating, especially in the south, which made a lot of sense. Boats. Boats are much easier to move along than roads back then. Roads, it rains, they become muddy. Roads are also easily could be targeted by bandits or criminals. A lot safer on the water. All right. Early agricultural societies of the Neolithic Age. So, early agricultural societies of the Neolithic. Remember, this is the New Stone Age. Agriculture here was founded a little later than other societies, other regions we've talked about. However, the real reason we don't talk about it until fourth of our early civilizations is because writing developed here. I'm going to say it differently. The evidence we have of writing developed here later, or the written record here, it comes later than other places. That doesn't mean they didn't have writing earlier, but it didn't survive. So the earliest records of writing we have are around the 1500 BCE, which is, well, in some cases, that's 1,000 years later than, say, Mesopotamia. Maybe even more than that. So maybe they did. But there's also a lot of evidence in China that they used disposable, decayable writing materials, bamboo and silk and things like that, which will simply disappear. As opposed to, you look at Egypt, Mesopotamia, they use stone and rock and clay and stuff like that, which is almost permanent. That may be why. All right. So the organization of agriculture in China may have developed entirely independent. We're not sure, but maybe. Chinese agriculture might have been inspired by, say, cultivation of rice in Southeast Asia, where we don't see the earliest civilizations develop. So they might have used this knowledge they gained of rice production from other societies to sort of give them a boost, to sort of boost up their society and their civilization. The earliest Neolithic villages occurred, give or take, 5,000 BCE. The primary grain crop we see is millet, in the north especially, millet in the north due to the drier conditions. Rice was in the south. So grain in the north, rice in the south, because rice requires much more water dependent. And of course, there's water everywhere. The rivers, the China is surrounded on two sides by oceans, so lots of fish, and different types of aqua life, different types of marine life, I guess is the way to put it. Domestication of livestock, sometime probably by 3000 BCE, they've domesticated livestock, pigs, dogs, cattle, sheep, water buffalo, things like this. Domesticated probably in that 5,000 to 3,000 range. We see most of these animals domesticated and being used for, the things you use, pigs and cattle and sheep and things like that for. Water buffalo is very important, especially in southern China. Maybe it was indigenous to southern China because of the large amount of, it's called water buffalo probably for a reason. I don't know nothing about water buffalo, but I'm just assuming a lot more water in southern China. You probably had a lot more of them. They were used as a plow animal, a draft animal, which also probably significantly allowed them to advance their civilization, because the more you can plow, the more efficiently you can plow, carry goods, the more quickly your population can grow and advance. And that is one of the hallmarks of civilization, is an expanding, a significantly, dramatically even, expanding population due to an improved agricultural base. Lots of cultural differences between North and South. These two Neolithic cultures of northern and southern China. We also can identify cultural differences between Eastern and Western China. Again, China geographically is huge. I mean, it's the size. Just the region we think of as China is the size of other continents. So it's a huge, it's a huge area. So we have big geographic and cultural differences north, south, east, and west. We can identify this most prominently due to different types of craft work. The different types of way crafts were made, pottery, jewelry, utilitarian things like glassware, urns, bottles, things like this are really unique and different depending on the regions of China, north, south, east, or west. Jade was very, very often used. Blades, weapons. We see very different styles of craft work with weaponry. Of course, ritual objects too. A lot of craft work was for ritual objects for religious use, for sacrifices and animal sacrifices, or simply to burn incense or to hold oils, things like this. So, lots of different regions, lots of regional flavor, really allowing, and of all of our early civilizations, China is the most cosmopolitan. It really is. Which means it has a lot of different cultures, lots of different ideas, lots of different peoples. We believe early China there was probably half a dozen different languages spoken. Really, it's almost like 6 different civilizations develop in the same large region. Ultimately, for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in this chapter, these civilizations are brought together, ultimately forming one civilization with a wide range of cultural practices. I covered that basically. Now here in the imagery, you see, of course, pottery here. You see these beautiful vases, and there you see this is not for ornamental. This is actually utilitarian. It's got seals. They've got corks of some sort here to seal them, which means they would have kept food safe from the elements, from spoilage, from moisture. Could have been to hold grain. Could have been to hold oils. Different types of drinks, who knows? And then here in the middle, you have pure jade. Jade was so common in China that you could actually just walk around and find chunks of jade laying on the ground. I've actually heard that even in recent times, if you go into the mountainous regions in China, which, there's huge mountain ranges, you can actually still find blocks like raw jade just laying on the ground. It's still possible to find that. It is so common for whatever reason, whatever geologic reason it is. And so jade became a very, very popular item to use for arts and crafts, religious purposes, jewelry. It's beautiful. This is probably the image of the Toati, if I'm saying that right. We'll talk about it later. The dragon image, which can both be a good or an evil spirit. I think we'll get into that a little bit later. And the hole, you got to wonder what the hole's for. Was it to make a pendant out of it? Was it a necklace, jewelry, something like that? Probably you would think, right? This gives you an idea of these two civilizations of China. You can see the Yellow River up here in the top. You can see the Yangtze down here. This region is massive. And these little squares are where all these little Neolithic settlements were found. So you can see where most of the early Stone Age settlements were found up here along the Yellow River. But that you can't discount the Yangtze. Lots of those found. And then you can even go down here further to the Z River, which we're not really going to talk about. Civilization developed along the Z River. Also lots of settlements here. This region up here is primarily where we're going to be discussing Chinese civilization. I don't know if I want to show you on this. Nothing really. You can always come back to it if you want to. The first dynasty, and that's what we call them in China. We call them, like in some places you call them empires. Sometimes we call them, well, I guess empires, kingdoms, dynasties. Yeah, that's really what we call it here. And it's usually named after the founding family. The founding family name is the Shang family, Shang dynasty. So from 1500 to 1000 BCE. Now, civilization just seems to have popped up and appeared in 1500. Of course, we know it didn't. Writing is when we have the first written records existing. It is certainly evident that there was Chinese civilization long before this. There were cities and probably empires and probably governments even before this time period. But with no written record, that is technically prehistory. So we don't really study that. That would be more of something, that would be more along the lines of anthropology. As historians, we don't really start our job until there's a written record. So before 1500, that's really more anthropology, I suppose. This was our first Bronze Age society in China we'll talk about, lasted around 500 years. The Shang dynasty, Shang society. The Shang kings ruled from very large settlements. Anyang was one of these large settlements. This was the center of their society for centuries, Anyang. Excavation of Anyang uncovered palaces, temples, altars. The construction was on earth, no stone. That is one of the unique things about Chinese civilization. Really, almost their entire civilization was built without stone. That's different than all others. Pretty much all other civs use stone as a foundation. China doesn't. So they didn't understand how to cut it, transport it, or they had no interest in it. We're not sure, but they didn't really use it. There was stone available. They didn't know how to cut it, transport it. I don't know. We're not really sure. Nonetheless, they didn't really use stone. Farming and forests around these urban areas, these cities. Craftsmen, other artisan worked making bronze items, jade items, and ceramic. So some of the most common artistic items or cultural items or military items: bronze, jade, ceramic. That right there is a bronze, is that a rhinoceros? Yeah, so a bronze rhinoceros. And you see bone down here. This is one of the ways we have writing, is they actually would write carvings, or they would actually write on bone. Yes, China's different a little bit. They didn't really use stone. They used bone. They used wood, bamboo, which I guess that's wood or a plant of some sort, and then they use silk and other cloths. None of these things, other than bone, none of these things, many of these didn't survive the elements, especially in southern China where it's wet. These things would have decayed, rotted away. Bone is, of course, much more resilient. And so some of the earliest writings we have from China actually are on bone, from the 1500s and a little before that. The Shang kings were military chiefs. They were warlords. They seem to wage constant war on other Chinese people. This is actually one of the ways in which China is brought together, through military conquest. This is what brings a peoples that are culturally divergent in many different ways, north, south, east, west, what ultimately brings the Chinese population together into one cohesive culture, if you will, although a very wide-ranging culture, more so than other societies we looked at, is warfare. In essence, conquest. Powerful kings conquering all their enemies and forming one large unified state. And of course, this ebbs and flows through Chinese history. We go from periods where there's a lot of small states to one or two large unified states which cover the majority of Chinese land, what we think of as China. Constant warfare, as I said, they use bronze weapons, bronze spears, bronze swords. This gave Shang warriors a technological advantage. It seems as though the Shang, and the reason they created this dynasty, this empire, this was certainly an empire, the reason they created this was because they appear to have been the only people using bronze, which is a technology that they learned from somewhere else. They probably learned along the trade routes maybe, and they managed to somehow control it, and to restrict the knowledge of making bronze from other societies around China. And so for a few centuries, it appears as though the Shangs are the only ones using bronze weaponry or bronze armor, which gives them a very important technological advantage over everyone else who's still using bone or wood or stone. So, quite an advantage. They used war chariots. You can see an image there of a war chariot there from a burial goods. They used archers, which also is a technology that just seems to appear in 1500, which, of course, that means it didn't. They had to have known this technology for years before, or they had to have learned it and borrowed it from someone else. We know before this, archery was being used in the Middle East. So it's hard to know where they got it from. You can see here, this is actually burial goods. This is actually common for Chinese emperors to be buried with all their worldly goods, including animals. There's actually evidence they would be buried with animals, with their horses, their chariots, their armor, even their servants, buried alive, or not. Either way, if they weren't buried alive, they were killed to be buried with the emperor to be used in the afterlife. Religious beliefs are different in China than other places. We don't have any quote-unquote world religions that develop here. What we again, there is no what we would call official religion of China. Well, really, it's more of a cultural religion, which is sort of a mixture of different religious beliefs. Cultural ancestor worship. The Shang King was a high priest. He offered sacrifices, human, animal, probably human sacrifices to some degree as well. And the high god we define as Dai. This was the high god. But they did believe in a pantheon of gods and spirits as well, as all early civilizations did. War captives were used as slaves. War captives were used as sacrifices, and there was lots of war, as I talked about. This was a society really built on warfare. They also had a very strong belief in ancestor worship, as I mentioned, even to the point of where it wasn't uncommon for families to bury their dead under their home, or actually have them in a room in their house. They're mummified remains. I don't know if they really mummified people, but they're desiccated remains, to even keep the bodies around in the house or under the house, because they believed the spirit was connected to the body. So therefore, keeping the body around would keep your ancestor spirits around to use to get blessings, to do prayers to ask for assistance, things like this. The king priest, so this king, the warlord, was also sort of the high priest as well. He used heated cattle bones, which would be placed in a fire, cracking them. He would then determine the means. Also, further, they would use, they would cut open animals, looking at their entrails. They would look at the birds in the sky, how the birds moved, things like this. And I talked about this picture here, this bone here sort of is like writing. They would write on bone. This particular one is the heated cattle bone. This isn't one they used for writing, but they did use bones for writing as well. This is one of those heated cattle bones. You can see the cracks. And then they would use those cracks to determine the future, to determine blessings or curses from the gods. This is how the gods would speak to them, one of the ways. All right. So royalty, aristocracy, the upper classes, they lived in large homes, we think. Many of the buildings were built with the perishable materials. Most things were made of wood. So above ground, that's another thing really different. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, lots of early civilizations, we have remains above ground because they used durable substances like stone. We have cities that we can excavate, and the walls, still parts of the walls exist. We don't have that with Chinese early civilization. They didn't use these durable substances, so literally the only thing we have left to look at is what's underground. They did build underground tombs. We see that. These tombs are filled with lots of practical items, ornaments, things needed in the afterlife, jewelry, probably clothes, animals, bronze, jade, ivory, and they always had dead servants. killed or buried alive, I don't know, but they always had dead servants in them as well, up and including even horses. Social distinctions were rigid. We think this was a very, we don't really call it a caste society, but yet that's really what it was, we think. Very hierarchical society with very specific social distinctions among the warrior class, the priest class, the farmers. Family names were important. Some societies, we don't really see evidence of that. Like Mesopotamia, there's no real evidence of family names. Here, though, family names are very important. Let's see what else we have there. Farmers, Neolithic tools. We think only the elite probably had access to bronze. The elite, either the upper class, the warlords, their families, the monarchs, the aristocracy, upper class, nobility. All these different words generally apply, and the warriors. Beyond that, we think regular people probably still use stone, bone, and wood for most things. Taxes were paid in food. So similarities and differences with other civs we looked at. So that also means something else about bronze. There wasn't a lot of it. It had to be used sparingly. So it was a very secret technology, I guess. So there's Anyang, Liuyang, the Zhou, the Shen, the Shi, some of these different families, these different societies. So you see here, this is the Shang early, this is pronounced Zhou, the early Zhou dynasties, which we'll talk about in a moment. Today, China is a huge area, much larger than what you see on this map. So this is a very small region. Bronze metalworking. Bronze was a very important part of the Shang dynasty. Bronze industry required a large labor force, lots of skilled artisans, and it was highly prized. It was certainly one of those things that you could imagine, because I know we saw things like this in other cultures. Even possession of bronze items without permission could result in probably criminal prosecution, maybe even punishment, execution, things like that. Bronze could only be handled or used or owned or acquired by people of certain status, either high status, warriors, stuff like this. Common people didn't really have access to bronze, we don't think. Even though common people might have been ones creating it, because it was a large industry, required thousands of people to do all the work, all the mining required to get the copper, and I think it's copper and tin to make bronze. So it was a big industry. Lots of money involved in it, but the use was limited to only upper class. Might have seen it used for cutlery, cups, plates, tools, forks, knives, things like that. We know religious items. Lots of religious items are made out of bronze. So common, we think of as domestic or religious items, household items, but still probably items that would have been held by the elite, not commoners. Bronze figured very important in religion and war. Lots of complex designs. They used molds, prefabricated parts that were put together. So, look how complicated this structure is here, this item with this face on it. This would have had to have been multiple parts, which required really a very complex understanding of metalworking. And look at the design on this. This is gorgeous. Look at this beautiful design here. And I can't tell if this is bronze or if this is jade, but still, it just demonstrates the artwork and the skill of the artists at the time period. Really pretty. Animal images were really common. Most Chinese items have some type of animal or spiritual image, probably associated with gods or spirits, animal spirits. Formed as animals or painted or etched into the bronze. The Taoti is this image right here, this sort of where we get the idea of the dragon in Chinese culture. The Taotie could both represent a spirit of blessing and hope, but it could also represent a spirit of curse and evil. Generally, what we seem to think is it represents I don't know how to put it, how gods could be both good and bad. In most cultures, gods represent a particular thing, love or war or violence or death or life. We think the Taotie is this spiritual totem which represented good or bad, depending on the situation. It might even reflect how the gods responded. If the gods were happy, then the Taotie would bring blessings and goodness and happiness. And if the gods were angry, the Taotie would be a symbol of evil and destruction. Open to interpretation as well. Very common image. We still don't know what it means. Scholars still have not really able to really concretely define exactly what the Taotie stands for. All the earliest imagery of it, we don't see any real explanations of it, which indicates that for your average Chinese person, they would have simply known. Everyone would have just known. It's not necessary to explain what something is when everybody knows what it is. Nowhere do we see a written explanation of how to use a spoon. When you see a spoon, you know how to use a spoon. Everyone knows how to use it. We don't find a written explanation of how you use a spoon. You dip it into something and you put it to your... You don't see that. Everyone knows how to use a spoon. So because there is no descriptions of the Taotie really of what it actually means, it's just assumed everybody in the culture knew. Which is unfortunate for us because we don't have a real definitive description of exactly its purpose. Other than it was important, because it's found everywhere. Etches and paintings and sculpture and artwork and religious items, common items, the imagery is everywhere in early Chinese culture. You can see it all over this. Look at it. There's the image there, the image there. It looks like a dragon, and this is probably where we get the idea of the dragon, the celestial dragon, which is part of Chinese culture and Chinese mythology. All right, so we have expensive skills, highly trained skills, rare materials to create bronze items in Shang and Zhou China. We'll talk about next. Who uses this stuff? Obviously, who would use it? That's a good discussion question. What type of people would use this pan with all this writing in it? This is a fancy piece of artwork. This looks like it is some type of a container, right, of some sort. Well, what could be put in it? I'm going to leave that open for you to think about. What could it be used for? Could it be religious? Could it be household use? And what does all the writing mean? I don't think your book actually tells you. I don't think your book translates this. So what do you think it means? What's the purpose of this? And further, this one. Look at this. It is a lid. This comes off. This is a container, and it's got these holes at the bottom. What could this be used for? Is it religious? Is it a utilitarian purpose? Is it something you'd have around in your kitchen or on your farm, or is it purely religious? First of all, look at the time and energy put into this. Who knows how many hours and what kind of skill and training it would have required? It would have been a lot. This would have been a highly prized item for somebody. This would have been as well. Look at the artwork on the side. This is not common stuff. Today, this isn't stuff you buy at Walmart. This is like stuff you buy at a really fancy store. Like you go to those clothing stores and there's only 5 dresses hanging on the rack and each one's like $2,000 or $5,000. That's this kind of stuff. This is not common stuff that you and I buy. This is stuff that like the Kardashians buy. This is like fancy stuff. So what? What does it mean? Who is it for? What does it mean? What is the purpose of these 2 items? Why were they created? What does it say about the society? That someone spent probably hundreds of hours putting these things together and creating them and designing them, and then doing all the artwork on them. You know what? Could be religious purposes, could be household purposes. You need to think about what was involved in making them, who they were made for, why were they made, the purpose of them. Think about that kind of stuff. Really does. And then finally, think about what was the role of writing in these. What is the role of language? There's no obvious writing on this, but you have these different symbols, these different symbols of vitality and other things. Here, of course, writing is hugely significant. There's like a whole story written down there. What's the significance of that? So yeah, a lot of really good stuff to think about there. Really is. All right, let's talk about writing. The development of writing. Writing was a major element in Chinese culture by 1200. Again, we find examples of written language as far back as about 15, which means it probably dates back further. But by 1200, it was common. We find a lot of examples of writing in their culture by 1200 BCE. And it was very advanced. It was a very advanced writing system by 1200 BCE, fully designed, hundreds of characters. The way Chinese writing works, as we're going to talk about, is usually one character. It represents an entire sentence or phrase or idea. So one single symbol would mean could be several words or even potentially an entire idea just wrapped up in one symbol. So this is a fully designed and fully functioning language by 1200s. So this language had to have been around for a very long time, and writing probably well before we know about it. But typically done on bone, silk, or bamboo, it simply doesn't survive. Now, the invention of writing allows China to have a culture, specifically a culture, a government, a bureaucracy, to have records, to have correspondence between government offices and officials. And simply put, without writing, you can't have a bureaucracy. You really can't. And bureaucracy is an element of a civilization. You have to have a unified, structured government to have a civilization of some sort. And they had that, which is necessary to have for writing to have that. The Chinese script is what we call logographic, meaning that each symbol represented individual words or even phrases. One symbol could represent a word or phrase or even a whole idea at times. And then when you put them together, it isn't like two words. When you put two things together, it can make a whole nother idea. So individually, they mean one thing, but next to each other or on top of each other, it's read vertically, they mean different things. It's really complicated. I think today the Chinese language has about 6,000 characters. I'm not saying all those are used every day commonly, because, obviously, there's a lot of words in the English dictionary you and I don't use. Lots of words we don't know. So if you think about it that way, 6,000 characters, probably not everyone knows all 6,000 characters. But still, it seems a pretty complicated language. Very complicated language. All right. While other societies use this type of writing, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, we call them ideograms. The Mesopotamians, we usually call them pictographs. All of these are similar in the fact that an image of some type represents other different things, represents words or phrases or ideas. They're just all different. Another thing which makes us really different, in case you're unaware, we don't use hieroglyphs anymore. We don't use cuneiform anymore. Pretty much the whole rest of the world switched to a phonetic alphabet in later years. A language that is actually defined by the letters representing sounds, phonetics from the mouth. So letters actually, the B is a B, and the C is a K, and the D is a D. So we actually have the letters in some form or another representing sounds. It's phonetic. All right. To where you can actually hear this. Now, China does not do that. China, Korea, Japan, which we're not really talking about those, their languages, all related, they don't really change. They maintain this logographic script until modern times. Still do. They're the only place in the world that really do that. Pretty much the entire rest of the world uses a phonetic alphabet of some type. The alphabets might be different. If you ever looked at the Russian alphabet, I don't know. Correct me. I don't know. Is that Cyrillic? Maybe you're wrong about that, but nonetheless, their alphabet it's phonetic, but of course the letters look much different than ours. So yeah, um, uh, we think that phonetic language is much easier to learn than say a logographic script. So maybe that is why pretty much the whole rest of the world eventually moved to phonetic, but they did not. At the time, it took years of training just to learn, years of training into an adult even to learn how to really fully express the Chinese language properly. And of course, today in America, by the time you're 6, 7, 8 years old, you're able to write most regular sentences, right? By the time you're 8, you're able to write in complete sentences. You're not writing like a professor or whatnot, but you're able to write comfortably. No, it usually took well into the middle or late teen years, 10 years longer than it does today, to actually learn the language. It took a lot longer to learn it completely. This language is similar to Korea, Vietnam, Japan. We actually think these other societies probably borrowed this language from China. They were closely in connection with Vietnam, Korea, Japan, other places in East Asia. So we think they actually probably borrowed this language from China. They learned from it. And this facilitated communication, which is very important. How can you trade with someone if you can't communicate with them? You really have to. You have to be able to communicate somehow. You have to find some type of a common way to communicate with your neighbors, to trade goods with them. So we think this might have been the main reason that these other societies developed languages that looked very much like Chinese to communicate, trade, deal with them, have negotiations, things like that. We know the pronunciation is different, whether you're Korean or Vietnamese, Japanese, Chinese. We know the pronunciation of many of the symbols is different, but the symbols are very similar. It's very obvious that these languages are all connected because you can find a multitude of symbols that are identical or nearly identical in different languages. So they all come from the same root, and our earliest evidence of this is China. But again, the language existed before we have writing in China. The language had probably existed for a long time before that. So we're not positive where it started, where it came from first. But as of our knowledge available to us, it does appear as though it's China. Also, the fact that the script really hasn't changed over the years. Honestly, the Chinese language it's changed, it certainly has, but the symbols really haven't changed much. They're still very much the same. I mean, look at this example here. Ancient Chinese language, it's got like 3 bumps and a little line. Look what it is today in modern. It's 3 lines. Very similar. Very similar. Well, this really was beneficial because it allowed modern Chinese scholars to pretty much translate early Chinese script without an intermediary. They didn't really have to have a Rosetta Stone, if you will, which is another language to use as an intermediary. They were able to simply take the old language and figure out the new language because it was so similar, which is really interesting. The language really hasn't changed much over thousands of years. Shang symbol, modern character. Look how close they are. Very similar. Some not as much, but others are very close. Very close. Literally, they just changed some of the angles a little bit, but very close symbols to the Shang symbol and the modern symbol. It's really beautiful language. It's sure it's well beyond me ever learning, but it's really pretty. I think this is where the modern art of calligraphy actually came from. Was from East Asia. It's beautiful. Comes from Asia, actually. Don't quote me on that. It might have actually come from... calligraphy might have actually come from the Arab world, the Middle East. Okay. We will now shift a little bit and talk about the Zhou. I believe it's pronounced Zhou dynasty. All right, so these Zhou were an outside people outside of the Shang dynasty area. They rose up, they defeated the Shang, they installed a new government. However, they retained much of the Shang culture, Chinese culture, and they also were the first dynasty to have a full written record of pretty much, their everything, their entire dynasty. All right, so Zhou politics. Book of the Documents is an early record of Chinese documents, speeches, historical events, all from the early Zhou dynasty. The documents reflect the Zhou appreciation for past history as a way to legitimize modern power. What they did in the Book of Documents, which is very creative, it's revisionist history, is they rewrote the history to show how when the Zhou came to power, it was at the defeating a tyrannical and evil Shang king. It doesn't tell the truth, which is probably that they were a conquering, invading peoples that basically conquered, defeated the Shang military, and took over, probably in a mass bloodshed, as was common anywhere in the world. But it gives the appearance as though the Zhou were the heroes. They're the ones that came in to save the Chinese people from the evil Shang. Well, lots of evidence indicates the Shang dynasty was actually very prosperous. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, they had human sacrifices, there were slaves, lots of poor people, but that also doesn't change under the Zhou either. Most of these Chinese dynasties are really characterized by an elite at the top, and the vast majority of the population are poor peasant farmers. They all pretty much resemble that. So, anyway, how's that song go? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Anyway, it also shows a close relationship between the king and heaven, claiming that the king had what we call the mandate of heaven, that the king was actually receiving the authority from the gods to rule the people. How convenient. How convenient. Again, how can you challenge that, right? I mean, realistically, most people fall in line. And they say, well, if the gods have blessed so-and-so to rule us, the gods can't be wrong, right? It's convenient, smart. Of course, this is a practice followed all around the world. The idea that rulers are given the blessings of the gods, divine rule, mandate of heaven, call it what you want. We see it in Europe, Asia, Africa, everywhere. This idea that the rulers are blessed by the gods to rule. It's simply a way of control. It's a system of control of the population. It is what it is, but it's very common. And this mandate of heaven is no different, and the ruler was characterized as the son of heaven, the son of the gods. There's even times when the ruler in Chinese history has been thought of as a god. Not just blessed by the gods or the son of the gods, but actually an incarnate god at times. They've been seen that way. Now, the way the understanding of this mandate of heaven also included that the ruler had to be ruling in the best interest of the people. The ruler had to bring prosperity to the nation. And if prosperity didn't exist, then perhaps the ruler didn't have the mandate of heaven any longer. That's, of course, which would get you executed or have some other warlord rise to power and overthrow you, which would have probably resulted in execution for you and probably your entire family. This became the core of Chinese political ideology. Now, don't get me wrong, this is, and I'm really still on the previous one, this has religious aspects, but this son of heaven, mandate of heaven is actually their political ideology, although it does have these religious aspects to it. Of course, this was a created idea. It was propaganda that the Zhou claimed when they took over Shang Dynasty. After all, how can you challenge someone who has the mandate of heaven, right? The gods have chosen us. And you could even see, like, definitive proof of it, because, hey, they won. the Shangs are gone. They executed the Shangs. The Shang dynasty's gone. That entire family line is gone, disappeared. Our family line is now in charge. Our people are in charge. So how can you really challenge that? Because, I mean, let's face it, if you challenge it, you're going to be the next head to roll. We know that. So, there you go. And of course, part of this rewriting of history in the Book of Documents says that, of course, the Shang rulers lost the mandate of heaven, although it wasn't really a thing under Shang dynasty. The Zhou said the Shang rulers no longer were being blessed by the gods, therefore, otherwise, how could they have come to power? How could the Zhous have come in and supplanted the Shang rulership if the gods were blessing them? I don't know, maybe it had something to do with a lot of swords and a lot of killing, but anyway, so Zhou China was decentralized rule. Decentralized rule, meaning lots of private lords, think of like local governors, ruling their individual territories and kingdoms. Although they were still subservient to the emperor, who had the mandate of heaven, individually they ruled. It is actually sort of like, I think, the United States today. The United States is decentralized rule. We have 50 unique governments, 50 states, that all operate independently, and yet there are certain requirements and mandates where they have to do things for the federal government. They have to follow certain federal government laws and regulations. But generally speaking, the 50 states are ruled independently by their own. They have their own governments, their own legislatures, their own judicial systems, all of that. The U.S. is sort of a decentralized rule, although it isn't exactly synonymous, because we have, the federal government is heavily tied into all of our state governments, but still, it's an idea like that. We're one unified nation with 50 different smaller governments within. Sort of a similar thing here. What were their requirements, and what did they owe to the emperor? Well, if the emperor asked for troops, they had to provide soldiers. That was one of the requirements to be given the protection of the empire, the dynasty. You had to give military existence. Of course, you had to pay taxes. Same thing today. The federal government takes troops from all 50 states. Everybody has to pay taxes, federal taxes, that kind of stuff. Over time, though, this actually became a problem. Over time, because China's a big place, still this doesn't cover nearly the size of modern-day China, but it was still a huge area for ancient times. Remember, no instant communications. It could take weeks or months to communicate from the capital with the outlying regions of the dynasty. It could take weeks to get communications out there and back. So, even a smaller territory for ancient times was huge. So over time, this decentralized rule actually brought down the Zhou dynasty, because these independent lords and rulers became too powerful. They had their own militaries. Eventually, they destabilized the entire government, each one wanting to be the leader, each one wanting to have the power, not wanting to heed the emperor whenever he would call and say, deliver me 1,000 soldiers, or deliver me 2 wagonfuls of gold, or whatever. And many of these regional rulers said, no, I want to keep that for my people. I want to keep my power. And I mean, it's obvious. You see how it goes. Ultimately, this leads to assassinations, civil war, warfare, strife, violence, and massive destabilization after 771. There were emperors assassinated. It was common. By 771, we have common regular warfare between the different states. Each of these different states, we call them, all within the Zhou dynasty, like today, the United States, and then we have 50 different states. Well, we have all these independent small states within the greater Zhou dynasty, and they start fighting amongst themselves. We see multiple warlords claiming that they have the mandate of heaven, that they should be the ones to be ruling. This is common. This happens in all early societies. And ultimately, by the 700s, we don't really have a united Zhou dynasty. We really have a group of small interdependent kingdoms. Even though there might have technically still been an emperor, many of these kingdoms didn't listen. Because after all, at the end of the day, how do you actually force compliance from the kingdoms? There is really only one way. Military might. That's really it. And if you don't have the military might or the money, and these independent kingdoms have their own armies, which they all did, what can you do? Literally, if you don't have the military might to conquer them again, you can't make them pay taxes, you can't make them obey your orders or your rules or your laws. You really can't. We see a couple important developments here. You see those, you can read those. This is a page from the Book of Documents. This is it's obviously probably not an original, but a copy, which most documents have been copied over time periods, dozens, hundreds of times. So this is a page from a copy of the Book of Documents. Pretty worn there. Can't really read it. This gives you an idea of the Zhou. So we saw the Shang, which is this smaller line. This is the same map we saw earlier. The Zhou is much bigger. Much bigger. Still, China today is much bigger than this. But still, it is also the first dynasty to encompass both rivers. It's the first time by around the year, 500 to 700, something like that. 800. I guess we'll say 800. We see the first dynasty in China that actually encompasses both rivers, the Yangtze and the Yellow. First time, which really created a unified China and starts to bring all these varied cultures together in the same box. To where we start calling all these different cultures, quote unquote, Chinese culture. Even though it's a mixture of a variety of different peoples. All right, life during the Zhou dynasty. Early on in the Zhou dynasty, it was all about aristocracy, elitism. We saw that. That was the way the Shangs operated. All the power in the Shang dynasty was entirely concentrated in the hands of the elite. This 1% at the top who had all the money, all the power, all the bronze. They were strong, and it was a society pretty much entirely defined by status. Everything in the Shang dynasty was about status. Well, we see some changes in the Zhou dynasty. We see some alterations in how Zhou culture operates. All right, in the Zhou dynasty, your title was typically inherited, which is common, like a lord or a duke. I mean, that's the kind of things, in Western culture we see these titles inherited. Then you have lower ranks of aristocracy. Aristocracy really broadens out under the Zhou. As opposed to this very slim elite line at the top, the 1%, we see more of like a 20% at the top of the Zhou. Big. It's still elite, but we now have this whole range of civil servants, bureaucrats, military leadership. Again, look at the size. The Zhou dynasty is like, 4 times? 4 times bigger than the Shang? At least 4 times bigger. Which means it required a much larger government, a lot more officials, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people in government office across all of the different, probably thousands of towns, dozens of cities. So yeah, it really required a lot more of a bureaucracy and a whole ranking system. So it wasn't just the elite lords and kings at the top. We have now a whole upper echelon of government and military leaders, across society, this hierarchy in this new. And then still hereditary privileges for the 1%, which still passed down. That's still sort of a holdover from the Shang. These individuals were often known as Shi. These were this upper class elite. These Shi is what they were known as. Below that is everyone else, all the regular people. Your typical workers, your typical farmers, your animal herders, your merchants. So this society was still a 2-class society, the same as the Shang. The difference is now, instead of Shang being like 1% or 5% and then everybody else, we see a 10 or 20% at the top and everybody else. So the halls of power have greatly expanded. However, still, the majority of the population lives in poverty as common, regular people, mostly farmers. The Book of Songs, which we find around 900 BCE, perhaps a copy. This might be the oldest copy we have because it might have been written before this. Many of these things might have been written before. collection of Chinese poetry, which tells us a lot about what life was like. Tells us what about life was like among the Chinese population. Religious ceremonies, I'm still talking about number 2 there. Religious ceremonies based on folk songs, based on legends. Lots of references to farming, seasons, climate, weather, animals, birds, and lots of imagery of farmers. Guides in there, rules, instructions on how to be a good farmer, how to be a good laborer. There was even love poetry in it. It's really an unusual collection. It has, in one collection, a variety of, again, poetry is really music. That's really where music comes from, is poetry. Or maybe vice versa. I don't know which. But I mean, really, most songs, if you put them in written form, can be poems. So this collection of poetry / songs seems to cover almost every aspect of Zhou life. It is an invaluable resource into what it was like to live in the Zhou dynasty around the 900s. Everything from the aristocrats to love songs, to working stories, to farming stories, legends, and religious rituals. I mean, it's got everything. It's pretty amazing. Which tells us so much about their society. It's really an invaluable resource that tells us so much about what it was to live in Chinese society in this time period. All right, concubinage. This was a part of Zhou society. This is a practice of where the upper class aristocrats would take multiple wives. Second, third, fourth wives, and it was a status and a wealth thing. In other words, the wealthier you were, the more wives you have, which means the richest elites might have dozens of wives. Concubines. They would have wife 1, which was the senior wife, but then they would have dozens of other wives. Concubines basically live in wives. This created a natural distrust of women because women were always infighting. They were always striving for power and authority, backstabbing, sometimes literally backstabbing each other. Because the only wife that counted was number 1. So you always want to be number 1. And the way to be number 1 sometimes meant killing number 1. And then and then everybody moves up a step. I mean, or discrediting number 1. Doing something to discredit her status. And then she might get knocked down and you get moved up. So it really created a situation where in the elite of Chinese society, women were in constant competition with each other, constantly fighting each other for status. They were seen as manipulators. Concubines would have legal children of the Lord. And then, of course, they would then manipulate to try and get their children of status. Because you had ranks of the wives, but then you also had ranks of the children. And in a society where inheritance is so important, whatever rank you are as a son is what matters. Because the difference between life of a rank 1 son or a rank 5 son is it's apples and oranges. One gets everything, gets all the land, gets the servants, gets all the status. The other might end up being a poor farmer somewhere. Totally different. So, yeah. So status and gender rights between men and women, boys and girls, they still always preferred boys. This was a society that did use what we call exposure, to where they would take girls and just get rid of them. They would leave them out in the elements. They would leave them out on the street, take them out in the woods, and then expose them to nature, and then just walk away and leave them. This was common in lots of early societies for girls. Boys were always desired, girls were not. Boys could be warriors, boys could be protectors, boys could be inheritors of property and land. Boys had rights, everything was for the boys. So almost all early societies devalued women and girls. It was just common, always worked out that way. Social mobility after 500 BCE. We do see lots in large cities after 500 BCE. we actually start to see the very first close to million-person cities. For 1,000 years, the only place in the world that had cities of this size was China. No one else even came close. China had million-person cities 1,000 years before anyone else did. Long before anyone else. So, let's see what else we got going on here. Cities, iron technology also came about around this time period. We see iron technology around 500. This, of course, spurs economic development. New weapon technology, new metal technology to build everything and to create everything, whether it be utilitarian or weapons, artistic goods, cultural goods. Lots of opportunity in iron. Iron making, whether it be weapons or art or jewelry, cookingware, whatever. Iron can be made into everything. And iron is actually much easier. Once you learn the technology, iron is much easier to deal with than bronze. Bronze is complicated, requires two different ores, two different metal ores. Iron requires just the one. I mean, there's other things involved, but it just requires one metal ore to make regular iron. Let's see what else we have going on here. Lots of financial opportunities. It almost creates a new middle class. The iron industry alone is thought to create almost a new middle class, which allows social mobility, which allows people to actually move up the social ladder through economic means. Again, your status was really, if you were the 1%, your status is based upon your family. But other than that, the rest of the status in society was really based upon money and learning. Education and money is really what all your rest. So you were not locked into the lower class. So that's why we don't really call this a caste society like we see in India. Because in India, it didn't matter your learning or your wealth. If you were low caste, you were always going to be low caste. Didn't really matter. China wasn't that way. Other than that 1% at the very top, the hereditary elite, everyone else, you could move up the ladder. You could be wealthy, you could have power, you could have mansions, you could have servants, you could have slaves, you could have status and acknowledgement through wealth and education. And iron really opened up the door to millions of people because the industry is huge. I mean, the processes of making iron from the mining to the finished goods is huge. It's a huge process requiring many, many people to make even ultimately one item, the output. So it opened up all kinds of opportunities. And of course, trade. This greatly facilitates trade. Once they start creating iron, this brand new metal, which is so important, so durable, so useful, keeps an edge, like a sharp edge. It doesn't dull easily. Highly valued. And so the trade possibilities and the money income opportunities for iron were dramatic. Plus, also around this time, they developed the first coinage. You actually see images of it right here. These are two coins. You see the first coinage developed. And coinage allows much easier transfer of money. You can actually, instead of walking around, because the most common way taxes were paid back then was labor or food. Well, labor is, you have to give your body. You literally have to pay for something, you have to go and literally give your body to someone for days or weeks or months to do work. Labor. Food requires you carrying around huge wagon loads full of corn or rice or millet or whatever. Now you can transfer all that into a bag of coins. Now you could have this little bag of coins. Or in one of the reasons they have holes in them is one of the ways they carried their coins, they would string them on probably a piece of leather or something, or whatever, and then they would string all the coins on there. So that was one of the ways they carried their money. Also really handy when you did religious observation, like religious, they would, I forget how to put it, it was sacrifice is not the right word. Anyway, you would do a prayer at a religious site or a religious altar or something like that, and you would actually nail up the coins. It's a donation, I guess, maybe is the right word. You would actually nail or attach the coins to the altar, and that was a way of paying for a blessing from the gods. Real interesting stuff. We have some religious practices held over from the Shang Dynasty. They honored, they made sacrifices, dead ancestors, for instance. The idea of burying people along with the dead also really declined under the Shang. They really stopped killing people and burying them with the elite and the wealthy. That was seen as a waste of life, obviously. And who the hell wants to be a servant to someone, knowing that when your master dies, you're going to get killed too? Not good. So they sort of stopped doing that. By the late Zhou period, the Songs of Chu, 5th century BCE. So this would be the Book of Songs. This is 900 BCE, which is technically the 10th century. It's always one more. So that's the 10th century. So by the 5th century BCE, that would be the 400s. We see the Song of Chu come along. Another collection of poetry, mostly religious, though. This is pretty much all aspects of culture. This is really some sort of almost what we call religious scripture. It's about the deities, the shamans, really these priests, these shamans, these magic medicine men. They're religious leaders. Lots of stories about religion and religious observation and rituals. So it's half narrative, basically telling stories about religious guidance and religious leaders, and then half instruction manual on how to do rituals, how to do sacrifices, how to follow certain steps to appease the spirits. And again, this is polytheistic society, believing in hundreds of different spirits and gods. And again, we don't really give a name to it. Today, we most often call it the Chinese cultural religion. Chinese cultural religion. But we don't really have a name for it exactly, at least not in the Western world. China probably has a name for it. Chinese people probably have a name for it, but we don't really have a name for it in the West, other than the Chinese cultural religious beliefs. Warring States period. So now we enter the Warring States period, 403 to 221. So as mentioned before, by 700 BCE or so, disputes among different Chinese regions was common. Lots of basically infighting, civil wars were starting to occur. But there was still a central, like an emperor, that people nominally paid homage to, even if they struggled amongst themselves over land and territory. By 403, though, new military technologies really changed the nature of warfare, really allowing war to escalate out of control, and allowing those that had the proper technologies to more easily dominate their neighbors. Ultimately, we see war on a scale in China that we've never seen anywhere else in the world. As a matter of fact, it will be long periods of time. It will be centuries before we see warfare on this scale again. Matter of fact, some historians have even gone as far as to say we don't see war on this scale again until modern times. Literally the last couple centuries. So for almost 2,000 years. There are armies in the field thought to number in the hundreds of thousands, maybe even as many as 250,000. Armies, again, that have never been seen until modern times. China had a massive population. Possibly even China as a whole population might have been as great as the entire rest of the world combined. Massive food production. I mean, the areas of agricultural food production in China were larger than all of Mesopotamia and all of Egypt combined. Not just the rivers, but the entire territories of these two places combined was fertile land in China for growing crops and rice and things. So it's not surprising that they had this massive population. It's not surprising they're the first cities in the world with millions of people. Not. Well, as a result of this massive population, food, of course, is still considered a significant aspect of wealth. New military technologies. We see warfare on a scale here that we will not see for a very long time. Crossbow is a major part of this. It's a brand new technology. the crossbow technology, good range, deadliness, can pierce right through armor, can take down horses, can pierce war chariots. Crossbow is used 2,000 years after this. They're still using crossbow in Europe to take down knights in armor. So it's a technology that is well ahead of its time and incredibly deadly, accurate, and powerful. Chinese had a proverb, and of course I'm paraphrasing, to the effect of, a soldier with a crossbow and a sword is equal to a normal 100 soldiers. I mean, certainly that's hyperbole, but at the same point, the point being made, give a soldier a crossbow and an iron sword, and he is, it's like comparing a tank to a jeep or something like that compared to normal soldiers. It was devastating. Soldiers train their entire lives how to use the crossbow quickly and efficiently. And even in this time period, they could fire crossbow bolts faster than guns fired 2,000 years after this. And they were just as deadly, if not more deadly, than guns. So, another big thing was cavalry. The cavalry, the horse soldier, the ability to ride horses and to fight effectively on horseback with bow, with spear, different weapons. One of the ways they actually learned this was from the armor as well. They started using full body armor in this time period. Not like a knight in steel armor, nothing like that, but sort of like the man here with this full body of armor of metal links, almost like a sort of a version of like what we call brigandine or like leather plate mixture. Your average typical soldier probably had a mixture of different pieces, whatever he could piece together to try and protect his body, but they did use that. Helmets as well. They used iron helmets, which at the time period made you very hard to kill, other than a direct hit. So we see let's see if we have it, the Jin. Yeah, they learned this cavalry technology from the Jin, who developed powerful cavalry resources and the ability to put tens of thousands of horses into the field. And, it's something you never experienced, being a person just standing in an open field and having a 1,000-pound horse with a 300-pound warrior on top of it in armor barreling down on you. I mean, for us, it'd be almost comparable to standing on a street and seeing a car zooming at you at 60 miles an hour, knowing you're going to die, knowing guaranteed I'm dead. That's what you would feel like as a warrior on a battlefield with a big armored horse bearing down on you. I mean, you stand there and die, or you run, and you'll probably die anyway. So it's easy to see how this new technology really resulted in massive death, destruction. Sometimes many victories will simply be moral victories, or no, that's the only way to put it, morale victories. They would simply scare other armies into surrendering, believing they didn't stand a chance. They would be defeated and destroyed, slaughtered by the thousands. Military success also depended on supplies. Today we have a saying, I was in the military, and the saying, it's simply an army marches on its stomach. Soldiers, no matter what weapons you give them, if they're hungry, they're practically useless. So military success depends on materials and goods. Chinese really began to push for a greater expansion of farmland and more crops and more food. And one of the reasons for this, we believe, was simply to supply their armies. They wanted massive populations, and then they in essence, they recruited all the young men, all the boys. They would recruit all of them, all the young ones, leaving the older men, like 30 plus, 40 plus, to do all the work. And anyone of the teen to 20 age was expected to enlist in military service. And so, yeah, they wanted this. We see an increase in land use. We see an increase in taxation. Taxes are largely dependent upon land. So the more and more land in use, the more and more people living on the land also means a bigger tax base. And in this period, the Warring States period, the tax base was often used for martial purposes. Often. More and more common, we see generals leading the armies, actual trained generals. We see schools actually being built during the Warring States period, military schools. what we'd call them military academies, specifically designed to train officers, to train leaders in military tactics and strategy. You see how long this warring states period lasted? I mean, if you really looked at the dates, 180 years. So we have a continual warring period here that lasted almost the length of the entire United States. With the U.S., we've been a country now for, 250 years-ish? Yeah, so for the most of what we would think of American history, we would have been at war the entire time, every single day, every single year. This is amazing. This is crazy. This became a way of life. Way of life in China simply became about war. Everything was about war preparation and war supplies, and grooming boys to become soldiers. This was a way of life. If you had boys, you knew they were going to leave and probably go die in war. Pretty crazy, actually. But we see military tactics, military training manuals come out in this time period. This is where many people have heard of the famous "The Art of War" by Sun. It goes by multiple different names. Sun Wu, Sun Tzu. There's a couple of different names. It's probably English. We screw up the spellings of the names and probably don't get it right. But it goes by a couple of different names. This particular art of war, which, by the way, even into modern times, this was I don't know if they still do, but at one point, West Point in America, the premier military training academy for officers in our country, for Army officers, I guess, they used this. They actually taught this. So thousands of years later, this is still being taught as military tactics. He argued that heroism was useless on a battlefield because heroes often turn up dead. And your goal in a battle is to win, to survive, not to die. So it is actually a better virtue to actually run away and fight another day. Or to use sneak tactics, to use guerrilla tactics, to attack where your enemy doesn't think you're going to attack, or to be where your enemy doesn't think you're going to be. So he trained military tactics, espionage, sneak attacks, things like this. Different ways to win the war. It also was very important discipline and training, and he also believed one of the two most important things was for soldiers to be disciplined, trained, and to follow their commanders' commands, if you will, without question. That is an element of the modern military. They have a chain of command, you obey your commanders without question. Even if you know they're sending you to your death, you're supposed to follow. You're supposed to obey those orders, even knowing you're going to your death. It's all for a greater good, a greater cause, which really becomes a basis for much modern warfare. The victorious states. Military improvements led some states to expand. You see some of the different states here: Chu, Han, Shin, Wei, Qi, Zhou, Yan. These are the big ones. There's like 7 really big ones, but there are other smaller states too. These are just the largest ones. These are all basically kingdoms led by families, led by warlords, and they're continually fighting each other for a century, almost 2 centuries. However, it isn't like all of them survive. As years go by, some states are absorbed and captured by others, and so over time, by the end, there's only 1 or 2 or 3 left, and they continually whittle each other down and try to conquer each one and absorb the other empire, the other kingdom is a better word. But for most of this warring states period, there was no clear victor, there was no clear winner. Certainly, everybody was losers. Millions of dead. No one has any idea how many died, but it's certainly conceivable that tens of millions died in warfare. And of course, another thing we don't really talk about with warfare is what comes after. Wars are fought on fields, farms, grasslands. They burn the forest, they burn the crops, families are murdered. Entire generations gone because they send those generations off to war. The catastrophic consequences of war reach far beyond the battlefield, to families, to homes, to communities. starvation, rape, disease. There's nothing to be celebrated about war. Not really. Not really. By the 3rd century, there were only about 7 states remaining. These states were more centralized. Authority was held firmly in the hands of a king. They all had very large armies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This is the largest armies China had ever put in the field until modern times. There were kings, multiple kings over large territories. By the end, though, by the 3rd century, there was only one state really left, and that's one we'll talk about the next time we come back. It's not the next chapter. Next time we come back to China, there was really only one left, and it eventually comes to dominate all the others, and that's the Shen. Eventually, the Shen comes to dominate all other territories, and that is the next dynasty we'll talk about, is the Shen dynasty, after we, a couple chapters down the line when we come back to China. State expansion, centralization of government, and by 221 BCE, it is pretty much just the Shen that are left standing. You can actually see how they're conquered here. These are the dates that they conquer. 278, the Shen conquer this region. 230s, they conquer the Han. 228, they conquer the Zhou, the Zhao. 225, they conquer the Wei. 221, they conquer the Shi, the Qi. 222, they conquer the Yan. So by 221, with the conquering of the Shi Qi, I apologize if I'm saying it wrong, the Shi or the Qi here, the conquering of their capital of Linzi, that was pretty much the consolidation of power under the Shen. If you go back to when they first had their first major victories in 278, that took them 50 years, took them almost 60 years to finally bring down all of the other dynasties, all of the other kingdoms. And again, the death toll here, millions, tens of millions, probably, over this time period. So many people dying needless deaths. But nothing unusual about China here, just the scale. The scale of death here is it's an order of magnitude greater than any other place we talked about. Middle East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece. It's a whole order of magnitude greater, at least. But they all did it. All these early societies did it. Conquest and expansion of empire is always bloody. Let's see, there's a Shen Empire by 221, comes to conquer all these other places. Actually, I am going to talk a little bit about Confucius. So I'll be right back with you. And we're back. So yeah, I want to include this section as well about Confucius and his followers. So during the Warring States period, it's sort of ironic in a way that we have sort of a golden age of intellectual and cultural growth in this time period. This might be the highest level of philosophical and intellectual development in early Chinese history up to this time period, and our period of Confucius. Confucius was one of the earliest intellectuals and philosophers in the world. He might have even generally predated much of the Greek philosophers. In Western civilization, the founding of really philosophy and intellectual pursuits really dates back to the Greeks, around the same time period. Well, the same thing, the time the Greeks were doing this, we see this occurring also among Chinese culture. And this is actually very common. In periods of heightened warfare and violence, we often see heightened periods of cultural and intellectual advancement. It's weirdly ironic. The most common reason for this that we come up with or theorize about is people are looking for an answer to the violence, a solution to it, a way to stop the violence, a way to find an outlet other than warfare, to forget how rough life can be and how violent it could be. Anyway, Confucius was one of the most preeminent philosophers and scholars in world history, certainly. The teachings are recorded in a book known as the Analects, as was often common with very important philosophers, religious prophets, which honestly, pretty similar, almost two sides of the same coin. What is often very common is they don't write much down during their lifetime, maybe write nothing down during their lifetime. Most of it is written down by their followers, by their students, either during or at the end or after their lifetime. Same case here. Analects was put down either near or actually after his death of Confucius by his followers, by his students as well. His teachings were based on ethical ideas of how society should be run, and they often reminded people of an earlier ethical age of the Zhou, this earlier Zhou age. Remember, this is now the Warring States period. So we went from the Shang at first, then the Zhou were in charge for the next 500 years, give or take. Now we're moving to the Warring States period. And so people are hearkening back to the good old days, the better times, as it always is. The older, it's always the better times. As a historian, I know the older days often weren't better. They weren't. They really weren't. Like in modern times, you see people harkening back to the days of like the 60s and the 70s and the 50s, and life was simpler and calmer. You know what? Also, it was full of racism, prejudice, discriminations. People were still lynched. So no, women had no rights. Literally other than the right to vote, women were treated as subservient. No, the good old days often weren't the good old days. Nostalgia is typically bullshit. It really is. But people love to talk about it. Well, same thing here. People harken back to the good old days of the Zhou before the war period. Don't get me wrong. The Zhou might have been better simply for the fact that it wasn't constant warfare. But anyway, he focused on ethics. He focused on this idea of what we often refer to, or I guess he referred to, as filial piety. Filial piety. What is this about? It's really very honorable, honestly. It's about treating, in case you ever heard of the Golden Rule, which is often referred to in Christianity, do unto others, others do unto you. That's actually Confucius. 500 years, 5 centuries before Jesus lived. This is Confucius's Golden Rule. Only it was slightly different, and as I think in Christianity it's referred to as do unto others as they do unto you. Confucius was more of the way Confucius, it's more translated as, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. In other words, don't be mean or cruel to someone if you don't expect them to be mean or cruel to you. So it's not so much it's not so much do something nice for someone, but more about don't do something bad. Otherwise, they'll do bad to you. But it's really interesting how you can see parallels here between later Christianity, which comes about centuries later, which it should be noted, the Greek philosophers were probably influenced by Confucius, and the Greek world was heavily influential upon Jesus. So the original Bible was written in Greek. So, it's certainly conceivable to see how Confucius' teachings actually influenced Christianity. It's interesting. I think there was actually something else I was going to say there, but now I've totally lost it. That's okay. So this idea of filial piety, which means you are supposed to fulfill your role in society. Only you are supposed to fulfill your role in regards to your friends, your neighbors, your family, your job, your leader, your government, the king, the emperor, whatever, and even your subordinates. So literally, almost like take it like a star or a star, whatever you want to call it, and maybe a wheel and spoke, a spoke and wheel pattern. You're in the center, and everywhere one of the spokes goes to, you are supposed to have a reciprocal relationship with them. You do to them, and they do to you. Only is within the proper guidelines of society. In other words, you are obedient and respectful to your Lord, and then your Lord will be respectful to you and take care of you and protect you, defend you. You teach your son, and your son is respectful to you. You have business relationships. You treat your business partners or customers fairly, and they treat you fairly by paying for their goods. They don't steal. So it's all about these reciprocal relationships in every direction with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, your lord, the government, whoever, and everyone. This idea of filial piety. Really interesting. You were supposed to respect each other and not offend each other, but it went both up and down. You respected and who was above you, and then the people below you were supposed to respect you, and you were supposed to treat them properly based upon their ranks. He stressed these cardinal relationships. The 5 cardinal relationships are really father-son, ruler-subject, husband-wife, elder-younger siblings, and friends, friend to friend, if you will. He also minimized class distinctions, which is one of the things that made him popular. We're all sort of in this together, all working as like a modern metaphor might be all like cogs in a machine. We're all pieces of the machine. We're all working together for a common goal, a common good. That was sort of how he saw it. Some people might have a higher cog than a lower cog. Some people might have higher rank than others, but we're all part of this greater machine, all working together, working towards a common goal. And all of us are necessary. Everybody must fulfill their role in this relationship, in this filial piety, to have the greater good for everybody work. And if anyone fails, if anyone doesn't fulfill their role, then the whole thing could fail. The whole society could collapse if individual pieces, which would be the people, don't fulfill their proper role in those relationships. Ruler, subject, father, son, husband, wife, elder, younger brother, and friend and friend. Ultimately, under filial piety, the way you respect all of the connections in your life, the people in your life, based upon those relationships, is actually more important than your status as rich or poor. Now, you could see how this would be very appealing to common poor people. I mean, you already had to obey the ruler. You already had to follow laws. You already had to do what you were supposed to do, right? And you're poor. You don't really have a lot of resources. You don't have opportunity. You don't have education. You're going to die. You're born poor. You're going to die poor. So you can see how this would be very appealing to the poor, but not so appealing to the rich. After all, how often do rich people like being told they're actually no different or they're the same as common people? No, they don't. They just don't. Defeats one of the purposes of becoming rich. Many people, one of the driving forces behind gathering wealth is for status. So if your status is now being told by Confucius, where you're just like the rest of us, no, not really. Certainly appealing to more lower classes and more the masses, which, by the way, is also the way it often is. Muhammad appealed to the masses. Jesus appealed to the masses. Buddha appealed to the masses. Common threads there. The ultimate Confucian virtue was Ren, which we loosely define as humanity, simply humanity towards others. He wanted people to care about each other. And again, it wasn't do unto others as you want done unto you. It was a do not do unto others as you do not want them to do unto you. In other words, don't go raping people if you don't want to be raped. Don't kill people if you don't want to die. Don't steal from people if you don't want them to steal from you. Very logical. How to do all this. This Confucian tradition really focused on, I'm still on 3 there, really focused on studying text, which required you had to learn to read and write. And China was the most literate society in early civilization. Large percentage of the population was literate, more than we see in any other early civilization. Confucian tradition again focused on studying text, reading poetry, tradition, meditation. Although meditation is a little bit less. It's really, truthfully, it's really more of a school setting. Reading, learning, practicing, studying. Confucius is really more of a school setting, less, sitting under a tree or meditating like with Buddha. It's really more of a school, learning, educational setting. Yeah, really more. Also, another thing, it it didn't deny religion. It did not deny religion. It did not deny the gods, but it also didn't glorify them or really even talk about them. Many Confucian teachings don't even really address what we would think of as gods or deities. That doesn't mean it's not spiritual, but it's more of an inner spiritual, more of a person spiritual, more of the focus on the man. As opposed to, and I do say man because it was focused on man. Confucian was patriarchal. It was a male-dominated society. Confucian put all of his terms in basically the center of the wheel was always the man. Women are always subsidiary or secondary in Confucian teachings. It didn't exclude religion completely, but really religion was not a significant part of this. The spirituality that did exist was really internalized. He was maybe the first real scholar in the world, our first real scholar, perhaps. And the spread of Confucian ideas, this is why Confucian exists today to us. If Confucian ideas had not been propagated and expanded upon, and he hadn't had all the students and followers, we might not even talk about him or even know who he was. The real success of Confucian and Confucianism, and then later Neo-Confucianism, which is not something I'm not going to talk about, and influences upon Greeks, which we know Confucius was influenced upon the Greeks. The Greeks wrote about this ancient Eastern scholar and philosopher, not by name, but considering the time period, the writings, it seems pretty clear that they were referring to what would have probably been Confucius, although possibly one of his students, possibly. But most of the reason that we even talk about Confucius anymore, and that he even exists anymore, really, our idea of Confucianism and filial piety, is because of his students or followers. Mencius is one. Mencius, which lived from around 370 to 300, he often was a, what's the word? I don't have my notes. Advisor. He was an advisor to kings and emperors and lords. He advised them and also tried to convert them to Confucianism, Confucian ideas. Did this. Mencius argued that human nature is basically good, because he argued that everybody's born with the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, and that you only become bad through serving bad rulers. So I'll say that again. Everyone is born good. In essence, you're born good or pure. And the way you become evil in your lifetime, because he accepts that there are evil people, the way you become evil and bad is through influences of basically along the cardinal relationships, specifically one, the relationship between subject and ruler. Subject and ruler. That one cardinal relationship is what made people evil, influenced by those above them who were evil. Now, how did they become evil? I don't know. I don't know if that's explained clearly. I guess somewhere they had a relationship and they became evil with someone or something. But, and what is the point of all this? It puts the entire emphasis on society, the good, the bad in society, the direction society is taking, the direction the entire state is taking, on the shoulders of the ruler. That's where the buck stops with the ruler. Basically, if society's going the wrong direction, it's the ruler's fault. If society's going the right direction, it's the ruler's fault. We do this today. We take national polls on the direction of the country and how well the leadership of our Congress and our president are leading the country. Even today, we still do this. This idea that our country really ebbs and flows based upon the rulership in Washington, D.C., whether it be Congress or the presidency. We still do this today. So he makes it very clear that it's all the ruler's fault, for good or bad. Very interesting kind of stuff. Now, Zunzi took it a little different. Zunzi saw it a little different. He lived from around 310 to 215. And again, you can see the dates here. None of these people knew Confucius. So these are multiple generations after Confucius' death. Students teaching students, becoming the master, teaching students, and like that. Zunzi, was a little different. Zunzi actually argued people are born bad. He observed babies and said babies are very selfish. Babies are selfish. Of course they are. They don't know any better. Babies are selfish. They want your attention. They constantly want food. They want milk. They want, give me something to suck on. That's just babies. That's just a baby, shit and pee and eat and sleep and cry. I mean, babies are selfish, but that's what they are. Well, he argued that that's what people are. People are born selfish. They're born selfish and greedy and bad. And the only way to improve is through learning and teaching and education. The only way to learn right from wrong. And the best way to learn right from wrong was to study Confucian ideals, to study filial piety. In other words, the solution to all society's ills was training, education, and proper study of Confucianism, above all else. Now, Zunzi also does something else a little different. Confucius basically ignored religion. Didn't really discount it, didn't really talk about it, sort of sidestepped it, this real idea of religion and gods. Zunzi didn't ignore this. He put forth arguments claiming that heaven and the gods actually did not intervene or have anything to do with our lives. That the heaven, the gods, he didn't say they didn't exist. Something like that probably would have got you executed. But he said that the heaven and the gods had nothing to do with us. Their concerns were far more, celestial, far more broad than caring what average everyday humans did. The idea that there was just so many people in China, at this point in time, China's population, by the 200 BCE, China's population, might have been 50 million people. Huge population, maybe. And by this point in time, in essence, the gods didn't care what 50 million people were doing, individual people. The gods had far more important things to worry about. That it didn't really affect us. Praying to gods, observing the gods, worshiping spirits was meaningless. Not that they didn't exist, but that we were like ants. We were like ants to them. Who gives a shit what an ant is doing? Unless it's crawling on you, right? Who cares? And that's sort of the same thing. So he didn't discount religion as false. He didn't worship that he didn't talk about religion being meaningless and useless, but just that we could stick with our typical traditions and rituals of religion. And it seems actually pretty obvious from his writings that he didn't really seem to believe this, but that he might have said it just to keep himself from getting executed. He didn't think we should abandon those rituals because people still believed in them. So his purpose in keeping religion around was incredibly practical, either to keep himself from getting killed or simply from the fact that most people believe. Like today, in today's world, even if someone who's an atheist, for instance, doesn't believe in God, that isn't a majority of the population. Polling I saw several years ago showed that still 80-90% of people in the world, which is the vast majority of people, 8 or 9 out of every 10 people in the world, still believe in a higher power of some sort. Although, of course, it varies across the world what type of, how you define higher power. Bottom line, most people still believe in God. The vast majority of people believe in God. So back then, it would have probably been 99% or 99.9%. It would have been everybody. So even though religion meant nothing to him really in his writings, he doesn't attack it directly, and he really gives a very rational reasoning that it was a foundation of society. Many people considered religion, ancestor worship to be incredibly important, and to try and dismiss everybody's beliefs would have been disastrous. Interesting stuff. So, and that's really how come, and then later we will actually talk, assuming I have time, we'll talk about Neo-Confucianism, which is a slightly different version, a modern, more relatively speaking, more modern version. All right, that is it for the chapter. I appreciate you going through it with me, and that's it, and we will talk next week. Peace out.